Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I work as a software consultant, which means I travel a lot for client meetings. After 3 years of cramming my 6'4" frame into middle seats and dealing with the agony of my knees pressed against the seat in front of me, I learned my lesson. Now I always book aisle seats, even if it costs extra. My company reimburses travel expenses, but honestly, I pay out of pocket for the legroom. It's worth every penny to avoid arriving at my destination feeling like I've been folded in half. This particular trip was a nightmare from start to finish. I'd spent 4 days in Chicago dealing with a client whose previous consultant had completely botched their database migration. 14-hour days, constant firefighting, and a hotel room that smelled like cigarettes despite being supposedly smoke-free. All I wanted was to get home to my apartment, order some takeout, and collapse on my couch. I'd chosen this flight because it was direct, and I'd managed to snag seat 12C, a nice aisle seat with decent legroom. Not first class, but good enough. I'd even upgraded to priority boarding so I could get settled without the usual chaos. When I got to my row, I stowed my carry-on in the overhead bin and settled into my seat. The middle seat next to me was empty, and the window seat had a young woman already buckled in, scrolling through her phone. Perfect. Maybe I'd get lucky and the middle seat would stay empty. I was just getting comfortable pulling out my book and adjusting my legs when this guy appeared in the aisle next to me. He was probably in his mid-20s, wearing a backwards baseball cap and a tank top that showed off his gym routine. He asked if we could switch seats because his girlfriend was by the window and he was stuck in the middle seat somewhere in the back. He pointed toward the back of the plane and I could see his seat. Row 28, middle seat, right between 2 other passengers who were already settling in. It was literally one of the worst seats on the plane, sandwiched between strangers with 0 leg room and right next to the bathrooms. I told him I was sorry, but I had booked this seat for a reason. I tried to keep my tone friendly but firm. I wasn't trying to be a jerk, but I'd learned from experience that giving up a good seat was always a mistake. He persisted, saying he was just trying to sit next to his girlfriend. He gestured toward the woman by the window who was now looking uncomfortable and pretending to be very interested in something on her phone. I explained that I understood his situation, but I wasn't willing to give up my comfort for a stranger. The guy then questioned why I needed the aisle seat if I was sitting alone. The question annoyed me. Like I needed to justify my seat choice to some random guy who clearly hadn't planned ahead. I told him it was because I had paid for it, and that's how seats work. His girlfriend finally looked up from her phone and told him it was fine, that they could just talk across the aisle. But he wasn't having it. His face was getting red and he was starting to attract attention from other passengers. He kept pushing, saying he was just asking for a simple favor and asking me not to be difficult. I pointed out that he was asking me to trade an aisle seat for a middle seat in the back row, which wasn't a simple favor, but a major downgrade. When he insisted it was just a seat, I asked him why he didn't stay in his own seat if it was no big deal. That's when he really lost it. He called me an inconsiderate loner and questioned what kind of person wouldn't help out a couple. I almost laughed. This guy had some nerve calling me inconsiderate when he was the one trying to guilt-trip a stranger into giving up their seat. I told him I was the kind of person who plans ahead and books the seat he wants. Other passengers were starting to stare now. The woman across the aisle was watching with wide eyes, and the man behind me was craning his neck to see what was happening. The guy actually waved his hand to get the attention of a flight attendant who was helping someone with their carry-on a few rows up. The flight attendant was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and the kind of patient expression that comes from dealing with difficult passengers every day. When she approached, the guy complained that I wouldn't switch seats with him so he could sit next to his girlfriend. The flight attendant looked at me, then at him, then at his girlfriend who was now sliding down in her seat like she wanted to disappear. The flight attendant explained that passengers aren't required to switch seats and that everyone has a right to keep the seat they purchased. The guy protested that they were a couple and asked if that didn't count for something. She told him she understood his frustration, but seat assignments are based on what passengers book and pay for. If he wanted to sit together, he should have booked seats together when he made his reservation. He said they had tried, but everything was sold out when they booked. The flight attendant apologized but explained that this didn't obligate other passengers to accommodate him. The guy looked around like he was hoping someone else would jump in and support him, but everyone was either looking away or openly annoyed with him for holding up the boarding process. He complained about what happened to people helping each other out. I responded by asking what happened to people taking responsibility for their own travel arrangements. The flight attendant then told him he needed to take his assigned seat because other passengers were waiting to board. He stormed off toward the back of the plane, muttering that the whole situation was really messed up. His girlfriend gave me an apologetic look and said sorry, explaining that he gets worked up about stuff sometimes. I told her it wasn't her fault and not to worry about it. The flight attendant lingered for a moment and asked if I was okay, offering to move me to another seat if I prefer. I thanked her, but said I was fine and that this was exactly where I wanted to be. When the plane finished boarding and we prepared for takeoff, I settled back into my aisle seat with my book. The guy spent the entire flight shooting dirty looks at me whenever he walked past to use the bathroom, which was frequently since he was stuck right next to them. His girlfriend actually seemed relieved that they weren't sitting together. She spent the flight reading peacefully by the window while he dealt with being squeezed between two strangers in the worst seats on the plane. When we landed, I grabbed my carry-on and headed for the exit. When I walked past his row, I could see him struggling to get his bag down from the overhead bin while being jostled by other passengers eager to get off the plane. I didn't feel bad for him, not even a little bit. It started 2 years ago when my wife and I bought our first house in Meadowbrook Estates, one of those cookie-cutter developments where every house looks exactly the same and the grass has to be precisely 2 inches tall or you get a nasty gram. The realtor warned us about the homeowners association but said they were reasonable people who just wanted to maintain property values. What a joke. The house came with this nightmare of a backyard feature, a steep slope behind the property that the builder had completely screwed up. The soil was basically clay mixed with rocks. It got blasted by sun all day and nothing would grow there. It looked like a brown scar cutting across our otherwise decent yard. The previous owners had clearly given up on it years ago. For the first few months, nobody bothered us about it. Then the letters started coming. The first one was polite enough, asking me to address the insufficient landscaping behind my property. I figured I'll throw some grass seed on it and call it a day. $50 worth of seed disappeared into that dead zone like it had never existed. The second letter was less friendly, giving me a second notice about failing to maintain community landscaping standards. This time I went all out, bought $300 worth of sod from the garden center and spent an entire weekend laying it down. By the next month, it was all dead. That's when I met the compliance committee. Picture 3 women in their 60s who had clearly never worked a real job in their lives and now spent their golden years terrorizing their neighbors with clipboards and measuring tapes. The leader was this woman who fit every Karen stereotype you can imagine. The haircut, the attitude, the whole package. Karen told me we needed to discuss my landscaping situation. I explained that I'd tried grass seed and sod, but nothing would grow back there. She said that wasn't their problem and that community standards required adequate green coverage. When I asked if we could work something out, she said the rules were the rules and that they'd start fining me if I didn't fix it. Her 2 friends nodded along like those little bobblehead dogs you see in car windows. I hired a landscaper for $800. He took one look at the slope and shook his head, telling me that some places just weren't meant to be green. He said I'd need to bring in tons of new soil and install irrigation, which would cost thousands of dollars. When I asked what would happen if I just left it natural, he said my homeowners association would probably have a problem with that. He wasn't wrong. 2 weeks later, another violation notice showed up, this time threatening daily fines if I didn't establish adequate green coverage using appropriate plant materials for erosion control within 30 days. I was sitting at my computer at 2 in the morning, stress shopping for more grass seed I couldn't afford, when I stumbled across this weird Reddit post about something called Bad Apples Double Mint Seed Bombs. The whole thing looked sketchy, basically these little clay balls packed with mint seeds that were supposed to solve impossible erosion problems. The reviews were insane. People talking about how these things would take over entire areas and nothing could stop them. For $35, I could get 5 seed bombs. I was facing hundreds of dollars in fines, so I figured why not. When they arrived, they looked like something a kid would make in art class. Just these lumpy brown balls that smelled faintly of mint. The instructions were simple. Chuck them where you want mint to grow and wait. That's when I had my malicious compliance moment. I pulled out the violation notice and read it again. It said to establish adequate green coverage using appropriate plant materials for erosion control. It didn't specify what kind of plants, just that they needed to be appropriate for erosion control and provide green coverage. I spent the next hour researching mint. Turns out it's actually perfect for erosion control. Deep root systems, spreads aggressively, thrives in terrible conditions. It checked every single box they demanded. Friday evening I went out to my dead zone and lobbed all 5 seed bombs like I was throwing grenades. Then I sat down and composed the most official sounding email I could manage. I wrote to the compliance committee that I was pleased to tell them that I had deployed professional grade erosion control featuring premium mint varieties specifically selected for aggressive establishment in challenging terrain. I explained that these plant materials met all requirements for appropriate green coverage and erosion control mentioned in their violation notice. I hit send and went to bed feeling pretty proud of myself. 6 weeks later, my dead zone looked like something from a nature documentary. Thick, lush green mint covering every inch of that slope. It was beautiful. The compliance officer did her monthly walkthrough and actually stopped to compliment me. Karen told me that whatever I'd done back there looked wonderful and was a very creative landscaping solution. I thanked her and said I'd used plant materials specifically selected for erosion control like she'd requested. She said it was certainly effective and that there would be no more violation notices for me. I thought I'd won. I was so wrong. By fall, I started noticing mint popping up in weird places. A few sprigs by the mailbox, some growing along the walking path. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, but then I remembered reading about mint's underground runners. Spring came and mint was everywhere. Around every mailbox, along the walking paths, even in the fancy entrance landscaping where they'd spend thousands on designer plants. The mint had snuck under fences and through drainage systems like some kind of green army. The phone call started in April. Karen called to say we needed to discuss my mint situation. When I asked what about it, she said it was spreading to common areas and that this was unacceptable. I told her I planted it on my property for erosion control like she'd asked. She demanded that I remove it immediately. I explained that I'd actually checked the charter and that section 4.2.7 specifically prohibited removal or disturbance of vegetation that originates from individual property owner plantings without explicit written consent. The silence on the other end was beautiful. Karen insisted that wasn't what that rule meant. I told her it was exactly what it meant, and that I'd be happy to give her a copy of the charter if she'd like to review it. She hung up on me. By summer, the situation was completely out of control. The Homeowners Association hired 3 different landscaping companies. Every single one told them the same thing. Once mint establishes itself like this, you basically have mint forever. One guy actually suggested they embrace it and market the neighborhood naturally aromatic. The community Facebook group became a war zone. Half the people were complaining about the mint taking over their flower beds. The other half were asking where they could harvest it for cocktails and cooking. I started getting friend requests from neighbors wanting to know my secret. The July Homeowners Association meeting was legendary. 20 minutes of heated debate about aggressive aromatic species management and the mint crisis. Karen stood up front with a PowerPoint presentation about residents who deliberately introduce invasive species but couldn't name names because that would violate the charter's rules about creating a hostile community environment. 3 people asked where they could buy the seed bombs. My next door neighbor came over the next day with a pitcher of mojitos made from mint she'd harvested from around the mailbox cluster. She told me she didn't know what I'd done, but this was the best thing that had ever happened to this neighborhood. I said I'd just given them exactly what they asked for. She mentioned that the mailman had said our whole street smelled like a spa now. She wasn't wrong. Every morning when I walked to get my mail, it smelled like I was walking through a mint field. People started taking evening walks just to enjoy the smell. The Homeowners Association tried to revise the charter to specifically address aggressive spreading plants, but they needed 75% approval from all homeowners. The vote failed spectacularly. Apparently, nobody wanted to give up their free mint supply. Last month, Karen sent out a passive-aggressive email about residents who show blatant disregard for community standards and the ongoing aromatic situation. She couldn't name names because that would violate the charter, but everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. I printed out the email and hung it on my refrigerator. The mint is still spreading. Every spring it comes back thicker and stronger. My slope looks incredible. Thick, lush, and green. The compliance committee has stopped doing their monthly walkthroughs of my property. Last weekend I hosted a neighborhood barbecue. I made mint juleps with ingredients harvested from the community mailbox area. 23 people showed up. Karen wasn't one of them. The Homeowners Association wanted green coverage. Mission accomplished. I'm a single dad who works 2 jobs to make ends meet. My boy is 8 years old, and he's my whole world. His mom left when he was 3, so it's just been the 2 of us ever since. I work at a warehouse during the week and pick up weekend shifts at a grocery store when I can. Money's always tight, but I try to give my kid the best childhood I can manage. That Saturday was one of those rare days when I didn't have to work. I've been promising my son for weeks that we'd go to Crystal Lake for a picnic. It's about an hour's drive from our apartment, but it's free and my boy loves looking for cool rocks by the water. We packed some sandwiches and juice boxes and headed out early. The lake has this rocky ledge that juts out over the water. It's maybe 4 feet high, nothing dangerous for kids who know how to swim. My son loves standing on it and pretending he's a pirate captain. I was sitting on our blanket about 20 feet away watching him play and eating my sandwich. That's when this woman and her kid showed up. She was probably in her 40s, wearing expensive workout clothes and talking loudly on her phone about some spa appointment. Her son looked to be about the same age as mine, maybe a little bigger. The woman, let's call her Karen, completely ignored her kid while she paced around yapping on her phone. Her son immediately zeroed in on my boy, who was still standing on the ledge looking out at the water. I watched when the other kid walked over and started bothering him. The other kid demanded that my son move because he wanted to stand in that exact spot. My son politely told him that he was there first, but that there was room for both of them. The other kid got angry and said he didn't want to share, claiming that his mom told him he could have whatever he wanted. My son tried to reason with him, explaining that wasn't how things worked and that they could both use the ledge. I started to get up from the blanket, sensing trouble, but what happened next was so fast I barely had time to react. The other kid suddenly shoved my son hard, trying to push him off the ledge and into the rocky water below. My boy, thank God, has good reflexes from all the playground bullies he's had to deal with. He stepped to the side just in time. The other kid's momentum carried him forward, and he went tumbling off the ledge instead. There was a splash and then screaming. Not from the kid who fell, from Karen, who had finally gotten off her phone. Karen started screaming about her baby and begging someone to help him. I immediately jumped up and ran to the edge. The water wasn't deep, maybe 5 feet, but there were rocks. The kid was flailing around, clearly panicked but not actually hurt. A couple of other people at the lake had already jumped in to help him out. That's when Karen completely lost it. Instead of checking on her son, who was being pulled safely from the water by 2 guys who'd been fishing nearby, she turned on my boy. Karen started screaming at my 8-year-old son, calling him a brat and accusing him of pushing her son. My son tried to defend himself, saying he didn't push anyone and that the other kid had tried to push him first, so he just moved out of the way. Karen didn't believe him and called him a liar, saying she saw what he did. I rushed over and stepped between them, trying to calm the situation down. I explained to Karen that her son had actually tried to push my boy off the ledge first, and that my son had just gone out of the way. Karen insisted that wasn't what happened and called my son a monster, saying her kid was an angel. I tried to suggest that we should just focus on making sure her son was okay, but that's when she did it. This crazy woman actually grabbed my son by the shoulders and started shaking him. Not gently, hard enough that his head was snapping back and forth. Karen screamed at my boy, saying he hurt her baby and could have killed him. Something inside me snapped. Nobody, and I mean nobody, puts their hands on my kid. I grabbed Karen by her hair and yanked her away from my son. She stumbled backward, finally letting go of him. I yelled at her to never touch my child again. Karen acted shocked and said she was calling the police. I told her to go ahead and call him, because she had just assaulted a minor. By now, a crowd had gathered. The two guys who'd pulled Karen's son from the water came over, along with several other families. Karen's son was sitting on a rock, completely fine except for being wet and scared. The first guy said he saw the whole thing and that the lady's kid had tried to push the other boy first. The second guy agreed and added that then she grabbed the kid and started shaking him, which wasn't right. Karen accused them all of lying and said they were only protecting me because they were all men. A woman from another family spoke up and said she wasn't a man, and she saw it too. She confirmed that Karen's son had started it, and that Karen had then attacked my little boy. Karen was getting more hysterical by the minute. She kept screaming about how everyone was against her, and how her son was a victim. Meanwhile, her kid was just sitting there, probably wondering why his mom was acting crazy instead of checking if he was hurt. Someone had already called 911, and within about 10 minutes, we could hear sirens. Two police officers showed up along with an ambulance. The EMTs immediately went to check on Karen's son while the cops started taking statements. The officer asked if someone could tell him what happened. Everyone started talking at once. The officer held up his hand and started taking statements one by one. Every single witness backed up my story, that Karen's son had tried to push mine off the ledge, that he'd fallen when my son dodged, and that Karen had then physically attacked my child. The officer asked Karen if it was true that multiple witnesses were saying she grabbed and shook my boy. Karen said my son had attacked her son and she was just defending him. The officer pointed out that witnesses were saying her son had started the physical contact by trying to push my boy off the ledge. Karen called them all liars and said it was discrimination. While Karen continued to rant, the EMTs finished checking her son. He was perfectly fine, not even a scratch, just wet and shaken up. The EMT announced that the boy was fine with no injuries, just scared. The officer asked me if I wanted to press charges for assault on my minor child. I said absolutely. Karen said they couldn't arrest her because she was a victim. The officer told her she was under arrest for assault on a minor. The satisfaction I felt watching them put handcuffs on Karen was incredible. She kept screaming about how unfair it was and how she was going to sue everyone. Her son started crying not because he was hurt, but because his mom was being arrested. The EMTs took Karen's son to the hospital just to be safe, even though he was fine. Child Services met them there since his mom was in custody. I found out later that Karen's ex-husband picked him up and that the kid was okay. Karen ended up pleading guilty to assault charges. She got community service and had to take anger management classes. She also had to pay for my son's therapy sessions because he was pretty shaken up by the whole thing. When we went to court, the judge actually thanked me for protecting my son and said that Karen's behavior was completely unacceptable. She tried to claim she was just defending her child, but when the judge heard that multiple witnesses saw her son try to push mine off a ledge first, and that she then physically attacked an 8-year-old, she wasn't having any of it. My son is fine now, by the way. We still go to Crystal Lake, but we stick to the beach area instead of the ledge. And every time we pass that spot, my boy grins and says he's glad he learned to dodge bullies at school because it saved him from taking a rocky swim. I'm a single dad raising 2 kids, my 17-year-old daughter and my 14-year-old stepson. His mom died 3 years ago, and I've had full custody since then. The kid's been through hell, but he's resilient. He's not antisocial or anything, just likes his space and tends to shut down when he gets overwhelmed. My daughter is the complete opposite. She's outgoing, popular, always has friends over. Last Friday, she asked if she could have a sleepover with 4 of her friends for the weekend. I said yes because she's a good kid and deserves to have fun with her friends. But I know her friends. They're loud. They're the type who think the whole world revolves around them. And they have this weird fascination with my stepson that always made me uncomfortable. They'd crowd him, ask him personal questions, treat him like some kind of exotic pet. So I laid down 2 simple rules. Stay out of his room and keep it down after 11 so everyone can sleep. That's it. 2 basic rules that any decent human being should be able to follow. Saturday night rolled around and the girls arrived around 6. They were already being loud in the driveway, squealing about something or other. I reminded my daughter about the rules, and she rolled her eyes and told me they knew and weren't going to bother him. Famous last words. Everything seemed fine for the first few hours. They were downstairs watching movies, doing their nails. Typical teenage girl stuff. My stepson was in his room drawing, which is his way of unwinding. Around 10, I decided to check on them. Not because I don't trust my daughter, but because I know her friends. I walked upstairs and immediately knew something was wrong. It was too quiet downstairs, but I could hear giggling coming from the wrong direction, from my stepson's room. I opened his door and saw a scene that made my blood boil. All 4 of her friends were in there, and they'd clearly been there for a while. 2 of them were sitting on his bed like they owned the place. One girl, let's call her Karen, was flipping through his sketchbook without permission. Another was going through his stuff on his desk, and they were all giggling in this cruel, mocking way. My stepson was sitting there frozen, tears in his eyes, completely shut down. This is what happens when he gets overwhelmed. He just stops responding to everything. I demanded to know what they were doing in there. Karen looked up from his sketchbook with this smug expression and said they were just looking at his drawings, calling them interesting in a way that made it clear she was making fun of him. The other girls started giggling again. I told them to get out immediately. My daughter tried to protest, saying they were just doing something innocent, but I cut her off and ordered all of them downstairs right away. They shuffled out, still giggling like it was all some big joke. My stepson still hadn't moved or said anything. I knelt down next to him and asked if he was okay. Nothing. He was staring at his hands, tears streaming down his face. I tried talking to him for a few minutes, but he was completely shut down. I knew from experience that he needed space to process. I went downstairs where the girls were whispering among themselves. My daughter looked defiant, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I told them I was calling all of their parents and they were going home. The protests started immediately. Karen said it wasn't fair and that they weren't doing anything wrong. Another friend claimed they were just trying to be nice to him. A third one said he was weird anyway, and they were just trying to help him be more social. That last comment made me see red. I asked them how invading his room, going through his personal belongings and mocking his artwork was supposed to help him be more social. Karen said they weren't mocking anything and called me dramatic. I told them to get their stuff because I was calling their parents right now. I pulled out my phone and started with Karen's mom. Let me tell you, that was a fun conversation. I explained that I needed her to come pick up Karen immediately because her daughter and her friends had invaded my son's room against explicit instructions, went through his personal belongings, and were making fun of his artwork. I mentioned that he doesn't handle having his space invaded well. There was a long pause before Karen's mom said she was sure it was just a misunderstanding. I told her there was no misunderstanding. I had specifically told them to stay out of his room, and they chose to ignore that. I insisted she come get her daughter. Karen was frantically whispering to her mom when she got off the phone, probably trying to spin the story. But I didn't care. I called all 4 sets of parents and told them exactly what happened. My daughter was furious. She said I had just ruined her entire social life and that her friends would never want to hang out with her again. I told her that was good. If they thought it was okay to torment a 14-year-old kid, then they weren't the kind of friends she should have. She argued that I was being dramatic and that they were just trying to include him. I explained that going through his sketchbook and sitting on his bed when he clearly didn't want them, there wasn't inclusion, it was harassment. She said I didn't understand anything about teenagers. I told her I understood bullying when I saw it and ordered her to go to her room so we could talk about it in the morning when she'd had time to think about what she did. The parents started arriving within the hour. Karen's mom tried to minimize it, saying kids will be kids. Another parent actually thanked me for calling and said he'd be having a serious conversation with his daughter about respecting other people's boundaries. It was a mixed bag, but I didn't care. I just wanted them out of my house. After everyone left, I went back to check on my stepson. He was still in his room, but at least he was responsive again. I asked how he was feeling. He said he was better and thanked me for making them leave. I told him he didn't have to thank me for that and that I should have checked on him sooner. He said it was okay, but admitted he didn't like when people went through his stuff. I told him I knew and that they had no right to do that. I apologized that it happened. We talked for a while about what happened and how he was feeling. He eventually said he wanted to be alone to decompress, which is normal for him. My daughter, on the other hand, gave me the silent treatment for the rest of the night. The next morning I tried to talk to her about it. She was still angry, insisting that her friends were just trying to be nice and that I overreacted. It took several conversations over the next few days before she finally admitted that maybe they had crossed some boundaries. But here's the kicker. 2 weeks later, I found out from another parent that Karen had been posting on social media about the whole thing, calling my stepson a freak and making fun of his artwork. She'd apparently taken pictures of his drawings with her phone while she was in his room. I screenshot everything and sent it to her mother, along with a message that if she didn't make her daughter take it down and apologize, I'd be reporting it to the school for cyberbullying. The posts were down within an hour, and Karen's mom called to apologize profusely. Apparently, Karen had been grounded for a month and lost her phone privileges. My daughter was horrified when I showed her the posts. She said she had no idea Karen was doing this. I told her this was why I reacted the way I did. I could see what they were really like, even if she couldn't. She ended up cutting ties with most of that friend group. She's made better friends since then, ones who actually respect her brother and our family rules. My stepson is doing better too. He's more comfortable having friends over now because he knows I'll enforce boundaries. And honestly, our relationship is stronger because he knows I'll always have his back, even when it's not the popular choice. My days are spent driving from one client location to another, fixing equipment, troubleshooting problems, and dealing with frustrated customers who just want their machines working again. The pay is decent, but the hours can be brutal if you let them be. My boss has always been clear about one thing though. He's said it in every team meeting, every performance review, and pretty much every chance he gets. There's never a reason to be working after 5 o'clock. If we can't get our job done in 8 hours, then someone else can do it. He's obsessed with this rule. No overtime, no exceptions, no excuses. The company gives us these pagers that we're supposed to carry during work hours. They're these clunky black things that beep at the worst possible moments. Most of the time it's just dispatch letting us know about a new service call or asking for an update on a job. But sometimes it's my boss checking up on us. This day started like any other. I had 4 service calls scheduled, spread across the county. The first was a routine maintenance check on some industrial equipment. The second was a more complex repair that took me most of the afternoon. By the time I finished the third call, it was already past 4 o'clock, and I was running behind schedule. The fourth call was at a small manufacturing plant about 20 minutes away. When I got there, the problem was more complicated than expected. The machine had multiple issues, and the client was getting impatient. I worked as fast as I could, but it was clear I wouldn't finish everything by 5. At exactly 4:50, my pager went off. I checked it and saw my boss's number. I sighed and looked around for a payphone. There was one in the lobby of the building I was working in. I walked over and dialed his number, checking my watch. It was 4:55. He finally answered and sounded irritated that it had taken me so long to call him back. I apologized and explained that I was in the middle of a repair. He brushed off my explanation and launched into a complaint about an expense report from last week. He was upset that I had charged mileage for the Henderson account, but he couldn't find the completed work order. I rolled my eyes. This was something that could easily wait until tomorrow, but he always had to micromanage everything. I told him that the work order was in the system and that I had submitted it on Friday. He insisted that he couldn't see it anywhere. Then he brought up another complaint about how Mrs. Johnson had called to say I was late to her appointment on Tuesday. I looked at my watch again. 4:58. He kept going, asking if I was even listening to him and telling me how important this was. He demanded that I go back through my paperwork and make sure everything was properly documented. I said I would check on it tomorrow, but he cut me off. He told me that tomorrow wasn't good enough. After I finished my current call, he wanted me to go back to the office and sort everything out tonight. 4:59. He continued his rant, telling me that my productivity had been slipping lately. He complained that too many calls that should take 2 hours were stretching into 3 or 4. 5 o'clock. On the dot. I hung up the phone without saying another word. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out my pager, and switched it off. I walked back to the client, packed up my tools, and explained that I'd have to finish the job tomorrow morning. Then I drove home. The next morning I got to the office at my usual time. I barely had my coffee poured when my boss stormed over to my desk. He was furious about what had happened yesterday. He demanded to know why I had hung up on him in the middle of an important conversation. I simply told him it was 5 o'clock. He couldn't believe that was my excuse. He said we were in the middle of an important conversation. That didn't matter. I reminded him that he had always said there was never a reason to be working after 5. If we couldn't get our job done in 8 hours, then someone else could do it. His face turned red. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. He tried to argue that this was different because he was my supervisor. When he called, I was supposed to answer. I agreed that this was true during work hours, but pointed out that he had called me at 4:50 and we were still talking at 5. That was overtime. He scoffed and said I didn't get overtime for a phone call. I pulled out my employee handbook and flipped to the relevant page. He had made such a big deal about the no overtime rule that I had actually read through all the policies. I explained that, according to company policy, any work-related activity after 5 o'clock was considered overtime and must be approved in advance. I showed him the exact section that said work-related phone calls, emails, and other communications outside of regular hours must be compensated as overtime unless specifically exempt. He was getting desperate now. He argued that I should have told him it was almost 5. I said I thought he knew what time it was since he was always telling us to watch the clock. He stood there for a moment, fuming. Other employees were starting to notice the commotion. He tried a different approach, saying that I had still left a client hanging and that was unprofessional. I explained that I had told the client I would return first thing in the morning to finish the job. They understood completely. I also mentioned that I had made sure to turn off my pager at exactly 5, just like he had always told us to do. He claimed he never told us to turn off our pagers. I reminded him that he said there was never a reason to be working after 5, and responding to pages was work. He realized he was backed into a corner. The more he argued, the more he contradicted his own rules. He finally gave up and told me to just get back to work. I said I actually needed to submit an overtime request for yesterday's phone call since it had lasted 3 minutes past 5. He was incredulous. He insisted I wasn't getting paid overtime for 3 minutes. I explained that company policy said all overtime must be compensated, regardless of duration. I filled out the overtime request form while he watched, his jaw clenched. When I handed it to him, he snatched it away and stormed back to his office. Later that week, Human Resources called me in for a meeting. Apparently, my boss had complained about my attitude problem, but when I explained the situation and showed them the employee handbook, they sided with me. They even approved my overtime request. From that day forward, my boss never called me after 5 o'clock again. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.